to me. You know, when I was young, I wanted to know what it said. You know, what do these Greek words say? And so that's why I spent so much time learning about ancient Greek and learning, you know, kind of what the things mean. So that's why I'm sharing what little I know, or try to, you know, express what I know about the history and the culture and the language. And by the way, you know, we can argue about a lot of stuff, but can you really argue about culture and language and history? I mean, we get on a real high esoteric level, and you kind of can, I guess, if you want to really discuss the in-depth meaning of a word. So, but there ain't that much in-depth. You saw how Greek words are put together. It's pretty easy. And it's pretty easy to see what their antecedents are and what their meanings are in a large context. So, in any case, that's what they do. They're supposed to do at colleges, but I'm always afraid that they are pulling from the wrong resources, and that's why I try to give you kind of a focus of the resources. But in any case, you know that our logos to telos is M-U-S-T-E-R-I-O-N, Musterion. Musterion is our logos to telos of Colossians. And by the way, a hint, Musterion is a logos to telos in general, although in different degrees, to a large degree of Paul's letters. Because Paul is trying to reach out to the Greeks, the Gentiles. The Gentiles is what we generally call the Greeks. That was the world. And by the way, the reason why it's really cool to be able to say speaking out or reaching out to the Greeks, because when we say reaching out to the Greeks, who is he reaching out to? Everybody in the world at the time, yeah. Because everybody who was anybody spoke Greek. From the Romans to the smallest peasant in the Levant, to the point that, what did Jesus tell his Sermon on the Mount in? Greek. You know, and this comes up again. The best proof text. How do you know that Jesus spoke mostly Greek? Because when he speaks Aramaic, he's always quoted. You don't quote somebody in Aramaic when they're speaking Aramaic all the time. That's silly. But if they're speaking Greek all the time, and every now and then they break into Aramaic, you quote them. This should be obvious to the most casual observer, as my high school professor used to say, high school teacher used to say, you know. He made a joke about that all the time, because he was the one who taught me about a lot of Greek philosophy. I had a Greek philosophy class with him. And, you know, the big thing is, right, patently obvious to the most casual observer, right? But if it's not pointed out to you, what's your assumption?
Speaking the language of the area that he's in.
Well, the language of the area, though, is Greek. Now, you see, this is the thing. We have an assumption of certain language, right? And by the way, this is still something debated by scholars, so don't feel bad about it. Scholars debate to this day, what was the prevalent language of the Levant? But you know why they argue this? Because what do they exclude most of the time? The New Testament documents. They exclude the New Testament documents almost all the time. Why? Although we showed the veracity of the text, remember when we went to the veracity of the text? That's why when you go to a class in this period, like the first century, in what document will they mainly use? If you go to a class in the first century in the Levant, history of the first century Levant, Josephus, yeah. Yet we showed in our class how Josephus doesn't measure up as a bibliographical historical document compared to the New Testament documents. Why not use the New Testament documents?
Because they're spiritual.
Because there's an assumption that they are a spiritual or religious document and not a historical document. This should get your little, like, you know, antennae up, right? Your Spider-Man sense. Yeah?
You probably told us this, but when and why did the Jewish sects at some point exclude teetotalers and get them, they want to disassociate themselves with them?
That is a beautiful question. The answer to that is encased in history, well known. 70 AD, with the destruction of the temple, was the first swipe. Well, number one, from 70 AD on, if you remember, you know, really, I told you before, in Acts, would the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, or Zealots be upset with Teen Hodos? None of them would be upset with Teen Hodos. The only guy that seemed to be really upset with Teen Hodos was Saul, right? And he was a really Pharisee's Pharisee, right? And in the diaspora. And why do you think they were upset in the diaspora?
They couldn't do their sacrifice. They couldn't go to the temple or whatever.
Well, I think the reason that they had so many problems in the diaspora and later on with the Pharisees is because there was a Pharisee. Remember, the Pharisees didn't stop being Pharisees when they joined Teen Hodos. They kept being Pharisees. But the Pharisees were pushing for what in Teen Hodos? Circumcision. Remember that? They were the circumcision, or the Judaizers. Judaizers isn't a great word because these guys, these Pharisees were probably members of Teen Hodos, right? But they were requiring that the Gentiles, the Greeks, be circumcised prior to the mikvah, before baptism, right? And this was a huge fight in the early church. So much so that the first council of the apostles, the elders, basically said that we're going to accept the Gentiles without circumcision. And so the big press was that until 70 AD. In 70 AD, the destruction of the temple. With the destruction of the temple, what was then the conclusion? Remember, I think I've mentioned it many times. What was the conclusion of the Jews in general about why the temple was destroyed? What was, I know I've told you this before. Before Malachi, or before the exile, pre-exilic, what was the approach culturally of Judaism to all the other cultures? Inclusive and assimilation. Inclusive and assimilation. Okay? And then they blamed the exile on what?
On the false god influence into their religion.
Well, assimilation and
Outside influence.
and the influences. So they went from that to what? What was the
Exclusive.
from the post-exilic to for the destruction of the temple? What was Jewish social and cultural approach to the world?
Oh, they isolated themselves.
No.
Well, they would try bringing people in.
Proselytizing, yes. Proselytizing. Because remember, I've gone through the steps, the 4 steps, because they were proselytizing like crazy. See, we've been taught, we've been taught since we were in Sunday school as first graders, kindergartners, that the Jews did what? Excluded Christians. That's not true. We've been taught they excluded Gentiles. That's not true. What they did was they were proselytizing. We know this from Josephus. We know this from other works, the apocryphal works. They were proselytizing like crazy. They were trying to bring Gentiles into Judaism. This is big time. You can't miss this. But in 70 AD, they blamed what on the destruction of the temple?
God's wrath.
God's wrath, why?
Because they brought non-believers in that did not follow the law.
Bingo. And exactly. And who were the group bringing the non-believers in without circumcision? Teen Hodos. Do you see this connection? It's a direct connection. So until 70 AD, basically there was, I think there was complete, well, not complete. It was just like, I think Brett or somebody, maybe Dave brought it up. Remember, we said that they've got, in every synagogue, you got, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, and Teen Hodos. And they're all together. And I think Dave or somebody asked, well, how can they coexist? Well, how do we coexist? We got liberals and Democrats and Republicans and, pro-abortion people even in our church. We got, you know what I'm saying? We have people with different viewpoints in our church, but we coexist, don't we? And that's true throughout Christendom. So it shouldn't be odd to you that there was, these 5 groups meeting in the same synagogues. But in 70 AD, a similar moment happened in Jewish thought, the destruction of the temple, which they blamed on proselytizing. And the group that was mainly proselytizing and bringing in these Gentiles was Teen Hodos. And then 125 AD set the scale. Because in 125 AD, Jewish people became non-legio regitis, non-legitimate religion in the Roman Empire. And when that happened, guess who else was non-regio legitis? Teen Hodos. Because Teen Hodos was considered a sect of Judaism. As a matter of fact, we know for a fact that from 70 AD to 125 AD, who was working to get Teen Hodos as a non-Regio Legitis? The Jews, in general. Okay? And guess what? It backfired on around 125 because the Zealots basically caused a conflagration, and I can never remember who the guy was, but there was a leader who led them in a revolt, and they were from that point on non-Regio Legitis. Until 352 or 350 something AD, and what happened then? Constantine declared that Christianity was now a Regio Legitis, and by the way, could use proselytizing from that point. This is a huge difference in what happened in the world. But in any case, that's why. That's why we are where we are today. But, you know, we've been taught, and we've got to get this out of our mind. We've been taught that Judaism is the same from Adam until Malachi. And it's the same from Adam until the Jews today. It isn't the same. This is one of those things that's patently obvious. All you got to do is study it. I've studied it. I've got the JPL handbook. I'll give you the information. You know, you can check it yourself on the internet, wherever you want to do. But Judaism is radically different today than it has ever been in the past. As a matter of fact, you've got to recognize a lot of things. They never looked at the Shema the way they did. I mean, I'm kind of digressing, but they never even looked at the Shema the way they did. Shema, the Lord our God is one. Ichad. The word Ichad, I think I've told you this before, it's a beautiful Hebraic word. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but that's okay. I do Greek. In any case, I know this word Ichad. What is the same meaning of the word Ichad? It's the word used when it says, when a man marries a woman and they come together and they shall be Ichad. One. So when the Lord our God is Ichad, never was interpreted in early Judaism to mean Elohim, which is God's, was El. If the Old Testament meant Elohim to be El, that is a singular God with a singular verb, it would have used El. It used Elohim with a singular verb, which indicates that God is more than one part, which, by the way, in Genesis is amazing. This is in Genesis 2 and 3. The Ruach, the Spirit of God, rested on the waters, and then God Amard, which, by the way, in the Septuagint is God Logos. And that's what John says, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. See? And so, therefore, Elohim, God's, is. Since about 600 AD, the Shema has been meant to mean the Lord our God is one, being one that is a singular being with no parts. But it's never meant that in the Old Testament. Just like the example of marriage. See, a man and woman don't come together to be one being. They don't, assimilate each other like an amoeba or
So is
something.
that their anti-Christ kind of translating out movement then? If they're saying, if the Jewish community now says it is.
600 AD. What happened in 600 AD that changed the face of the Jewish world? Huh? Muhammad. The Muslim faith was invented by Muhammad in about 600 AD. And what happened was, as the Jews were coexisting with Christians pretty strongly, pretty well, up to that point. But what happened that began to split? Basically, Muslims, and they had to have an answer to Muslims. The Christians had to have an answer to Muslims, and, well, Christianity is Christianity. They really didn't have to change a whole lot. But the Jews had a huge change that was made because they felt very threatened by Mohammedanism, by Islam. And so in that, the reaction to both Christians, which had been bubbling up for a long time in the Jewish world, and to Islam, basically caused a lot of the changes in about 600 AD. So this is what you had with this at this time. So in history, and this is what I tell all my classes when I teach history, this history class. What I tell you is this: everything in history just didn't happen. it has antecedents. It has, predecessors of reason. And there is a reason for everything. Things just don't happen in history. So when you see something that happens, what do you look for? Yeah, the cause, the why. That's what I always try to dig back into, and that's, part of the huge thing. Like the words I gave today, and I checked, it's really funny. I don't know how I got the wrong words. What I do is I go through I go to my Greek New Testament, and I look for the words so that I give them to you. But, sometimes Paul uses some really complex words, especially ones that are very similar to one another. Have you seen that? He uses very similar words on purpose. So I got the wrong one. I pulled the wrong Greek words for some reason. I must have been sleeping. But anyway, I got these right here. This is Dogmasin.
You don't want to know.
Dogmasin.
Your wife is dogging on you.
Is dogma? It's all right. Okay, well, what do you think dogma means, right? Pull it out of your brain. This is dogma. In English, dogma means something, right? And, dogma, doctrine, right? Theology. Dogma is usually something, but in Greek, dogma means literally, okay? It comes from doko, to think, but it means a law or a decree or an ordinance. Now, this is different than the word that Paul uses for law. What's the word that Paul uses for law when he speaks about the law of the Jewish law? Do you remember? Nomos. Nomos. And the reason they're different is because generally nomos is written down and dogma isn't. Dogma is a decree. Dogma is a decree. Dogma could also be considered a natural law. That is a law that just comes, thou shalt not murder seems to us to be a dogma, a natural law. So dogma and nomos are a little bit different. Now, if you state that dogma is written down, which we'll see in the text, then you're saying something interesting. But we'll see.
Is there a difference between God's law and human law, man's law? In
Yes.
the Greeks?
Oh, yes.
Different word?
There is a sacred word in Greek that means God's law. And I can't remember it right off the top of my head. When we were in Corinthians, I talked about this word, and I wish I could remember what the word is. But there is a specific word in Greek that means the law of God. And it's not nomos, and it's not dogma.
Would Paul have used Torah? I mean, what would he have used?
No, he used nomos.
He would use them.
He used nomos, yeah. Nomos, Paul uses nomos almost exclusively for the law of Moses, for Torah. And Jesus does too. If you remember from the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the High Place, Jesus used nomos. Cherographon. Cherographia. Cherographia. You can get this one. Graphia. Graphics. Graphia. Want to take a guess? Writing. In Greek, graphics. Graphio mean to write something down. And this is not Kyrios. This is not Kyrios or the basis of Kyrios. This comes literally from the word cheo, to pour, meaning like pouring rainy season. And let's see. So literally, okay, cherio. This is an interesting Greek word. I don't know if I want to go into huge detail about this, but okay. Pouring rain, pouring anything. You put your hand out, and what do? You cup your hand to fill it, right? So cherio, this word specifically means something related to cupping the hand. That's where it's kind of, it has, I'm not saying euphemistic, but a meaning that's, physically concrete. But in the Greek, this means literally handwriting. Handwriting. It's just, they get to the word in a different way. And we've seen this before. I mean, it's not unusual in English. So this means, by the way, when you see a word that makes a transition like that, what does that usually mean about that word? It's been around a long time, right? Because newer words tend to retain their meanings, their absolute meanings over time, if they're brand new. But an older word, what happens to an older word? It changes in meaning. So this means that this word probably, you know, the hand part especially, but it's interesting that we have an old word grafted onto, is it new? See? This may be from the very beginning of kind of Greek thought, to write by hand. And you say, well, did they have the printing press? See? This is a good thought. What does it mean to write by hand as opposed to writing some other way? And I suspect what they mean is, remember what I told you about writing? Who wrote for you? Your scribe. So this may mean that you are physically writing it yourself. So when you say, and this is why it could be a really old word. Because if a king was Kyriografia himself, that means he wrote it himself as opposed to his scribe. Let's see. This one, E-Z-A-L-E-I-P-S-A-S. And also, the sound could be P-H, and I think the sound is probably closer to P-H. Exalifitas. This means specifically, oh, I love this word. I really, okay. Ek, meaning, okay, from or out of. This is the ek, ek, so this is from. A is the negative participle, so it's like this is a negative. In this case, it's not negative, it's a union participle, so it's a union. I know they're kind of messing this up. The A is generally, we think, this is lipo. Lipo, what's lipo? Any nurses? Fat. Fat, yes, fat, or grease. And then, let's see, fitas, is that the other part, fitas? Yes. This means, okay, to smear. To smear. Smear. This is a really powerful word. Matter of fact, this word, alitas, alipio, means to anoint. Paul picked this word for a specific reason, but this means to anoint, okay? But this means from using anointing fat to smear, okay? Now, this is a very complex word. It's translated in the NIV, I think, to erase, but in King James it says blot out or wipe away. This is a word that's used when you take fat to erase a papyrus, or not a papyrus, a vellum. You can't erase a papyrus. What if you took fat to paper? What happens to the paper? Okay, you have no more paper.
Chemical reaction.
But if you take fat to vellum, to skin,
Dissolves the ink.
it dissolves ink. And this word, okay, but notice what the words Paul is using. There are other words to use, okay, that you could say to erase, but this is a very specific word to mean that you're erasing vellum. But you notice in the middle of the word is the word anoint. Who is the anointed? Christos. Christos means the anointed one. Okay? So, you can't pass over this stuff. Paul's a very complex writer. He's picking his words very carefully to make a point. Now, oh, and I got one more. This is a really cool word. This is not misdone. This is true. It's an H-A sound, H-A-P-H-E, haphe, and the word is happhomai, haphe. Look how short a word, huh? This means, okay, did I do the whole thing? Yeah, okay. You notice this word means hapto. It comes from hapto. Hapto means to light on fire. It means to touch the fire to something. Okay, what are you touching the fire to?
Something else to make it hotter?
To do what? Okay, all right. People don't boil water in this day and age, right? Why would you boil water? Why do you light fires? Sacrifice. Okay? This word hapto is a word meaning to light the sacrifice. Okay? In the King James, it means to touch. And haptomai means to touch. But you notice, It especially means to light on fire, to touch with fire. This has become very important when we get into it. So let's get to chapter 2. Let's see.
Is the word you were looking for themis? T-H-E-M-I-S?
Themis for...
For divine law? As opposed to...
For-
law?
Yes! I think that's correct, yes. Did you look it up? Themis.
did.
Yes. There you go. Very good. The power of the iPad. I love it. Thank you very much. Themis. I think that's correct. I'd have to go back and look at my notes, but I don't, that sounds exactly the correct word.
We'll put a little side screen up here for you.
Well, remember I told you, Greek has sacred words and it has profane words or regular words used in civil thought. And it's in, Paul uses, my favorite word, epithumia. Epithumia, which we just cast away as lust, which means the sense of the sacrifice. Powerful sacred word in Greek. But, it's lust. Oh, it's lust. Missing the whole cultural, point. So yeah, I think that's exactly correct. In what you find in Greek, and it's not true of every word, but you find many words that are sacred words. So let's see. I'm not going to, I don't have time to do a whole build up. We've looked at this, we've seen the introduction by Paul. Paul's not there, he's never been there. He introduces himself, he brings us up to speed. He says, I'm going to basically, my logos to tell us is I'm going to show you about Christ, about how to keep Christ forever. That's his whole point. I mean, I'm very simplifying. We went through it. It's very complex in how he builds it up. But his whole logos to tell us was based in the Musterion. That's what he said. He said the point is the mystery of Christ, and the mystery of Christ is what? The thing that holds you to Christ. That's what he said. So now the whole rest of this is explaining, that is the logos for the Musterion. And we've gotten up, we saw that in every case, last week we had the circumcision imagery that was overlaid then with what imagery? Circumcision was overlaid with baptism. Remember baptism? He said, and the words he used even, the words he used in the Greek pointed to. It's amazing. Paul's a really smart writer. He brings in a topic, and then the introduction of the topic is in what you'd think was a totally different topic. Because remember, he applied the idea of the foreskin being taken, in circumcision with the divestment of clothing for baptism. And then, bingo, bango, bongo, the next verse is about baptism. And he's talking about spiritual sense of, what does circumcision mean in a spiritual sense? And then he segues into the concept of baptism. He talks about Christ being buried with Christ, of Christ being egerio nekros, raised from the dead. And then he goes into the idea of baptism being interred with Christ, going to the funeral procession, remember, with Christ, and then being, it's suni egerio, I think, being raised with Christ.
So this all goes back to your discussion, do we need to be circumcised? The answer is we've been baptized.
That's Paul's answer. And remember...
Well, that seems to have carried the council.
Well...
Not
But
entirely, but-
circumcision was a prerequisite for the mikveh.
Yes.
And basically Paul has said